Hello class, this is part 11 in the video series Foundations of Literary Study, and our topic today is rhyme and meter, or prosody. So we'll start with meter first, which students find a little bit more challenging to understand at first. So poetry is a form of verbal expression that predates print culture. Sometimes students ask me, where did rhyme and meter come from? What's the origin of it? In many ancient civilizations, poems were recited or sung rather than being read, and often to the accompaniment of music. Rhyme, sound repetition, and meter, which is rhythm established by uniform syllabic patterns, were mnemonic devices to aid the poet in recitation. So over time, these patterns would become intrinsic to many forms of poetry and have been adapted to different languages and modified by new cultural influences over the centuries. Many poets today still compose in these traditional forms. The study of rhyme and meter is called prosody, and it is indispensable to students of literature. So in English poetry, meter is determined by units of stressed and unstressed syllables called feet. The smallest foot is 2 syllables, but there are also feet of 3 syllables and sometimes more. I'm going to give you the 4 most common metrical feet, starting with one that you probably recognize, the I am, which is an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. And then its inverse is the trochee, which is a stressed syllable followed by an unstressed syllable. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of trisyllabic feet: an anapest, which is 2 unstressed syllables followed by a stressed syllable, and then a dactyl, which is the opposite, a stressed syllable followed by 2 unstressed syllables. So if you look at the examples there, starting at the top row, I have an I am followed by an anapest, a fly in my eye, and then in the bottom row, I have a trochee followed by a dactyl, pumpkin musical. Sounds like a Tim Burton movie. Musical is kind of a funny one. The third syllable in musical could be stressed in certain contexts. That's what we call a variable syllable. It just kind of depends on what's around it, whether or not that third syllable receives a stress. In the example here, it does not. So the measure of a verse or line of poetry is determined by the number of its feet. Now, I just showed you 4 different kinds of feet. So you would look at a line and count them out to determine its measure. So the process of reading a poem to demarcate its metrical pattern is called scansion. You say, I'm scanning the poem to discern its meter. We use accent marks. I use the breve and acute accent marks to track a poem's meter, and you'll see that in my example in just a few minutes. But first, let's talk about different kinds of lines. There's a trimeter line, which has 3 feet, a tetrameter line, which will have 4 feet, the pentameter line, which is the most common, and you've probably heard of pentameter before, 5 feet, and then hexameter lines have 6 feet. And there are longer lines, but these are the 4 most common by far. So I'm going to scoot those over and get this poem, part of a poem, 591, Emily Dickinson, I heard of fly buzz when I died, just to give you an example of scansion, how I annotate meter, and then I will apply the terminology here. So the first line there, I willed my keepsakes signed away, and I'm going to use my accent marks there. So there is the first foot. I willed my keepsakes signed away. I willed my keepsakes signed away. So those are all iambs. We can establish this is iambic. It's unstressed followed by stressed syllables. And then we simply count them out. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, which means that this is a line of iambic tetrameter. Now the next line looks shorter, so when we count out the syllables in the second line, what portion of me be? We've got 3 feet. Again, all iambs. We're still iambic here. With 1, 2, 3 iambs, which makes the second line an example of trimeter. So iambic trimeter. And in fact, this poem is in a measure called the ballad stanza, which is alternating lines of tetrameter and trimeter. And Dickinson in this case uses iambs. So take a moment to, you can pause the video at this point if you want and see if you can scan out the rest of these lines. I'll go ahead and finish it off here. With blue, uncertain, stumbling buzz between the light and me. And then the windows failed, and then I could not see to see. So let's talk now about rhyme. So rhyme is the repetition of vowel sounds at regular intervals in a line or stanza of verse, a stanza being a group of lines formed into a pattern. Many stanzaic forms are defined by a specific pattern of rhymes, or rhyme scheme we call it. Most rhyming words are placed at the ends of lines, but occasionally they appear in the same line, which is called internal rhyme. A couplet occurs when 2 consecutive lines end in rhyming words. There are triplets, those are less common. But the most common stanza type in English poetry is the quatrain. And we just saw this with Emily Dickinson's poem, I Heard a Fly Buzz, which is 4 lines of alternating end rhyme. It could either have the second and fourth lines rhyming, or it could have the first and third and the second of fourth and fourth lines rhyming. The X there, the XA, XA, X always means no rhyme. So longer stanzas, such as the Spenserian stanza, which has 9 lines, and Rhyme Royal, which has 7 lines, involve more complex patterns than the typical quatrain. So not all poetry rhymes, of course. Shakespeare and Milton composed in blank verse or unrhymed lines of iambic pentameter. The practice of writing poetry without rhyme or meter, which is called free verse, and sometimes students get free verse and blank verse mixed up. Free verse has neither rhyme nor meter. That's a relatively recent development in the history of poetry. Whitman introduced it in Leaves of Grass, but poets often employ other sound effects that should not be confused with rhyme. One of these is onomatopoeia, which is the formation of words to imitate sounds, for example, buzz, moo, whoosh, crackle, and alliteration, which dates back to ancient oral traditions, and that's the repetition of initial consonant sounds, not vowel sounds, in nearby words, as in this line from Beowulf, Grendel's head was hauled by the hair. We had that initial H sound there. It's a good example of alliteration. So here's a longer poem by Dickinson. There's a certain slant of light. I'll go ahead and read it first. There's a certain slant of light, winter afternoons, that oppresses like the heft of cathedral tunes. Heavenly hurt it gives us, we can find no scar, but internal difference where the meanings are. None may teach it any, 'tis the sealed despair, an imperial affliction sent us of the air. When it comes, the landscape listens, shadows hold their breath. When it goes, 'tis like the distance on the look of death. So I'm going to annotate the first quatrain and the last quatrain real quick. You'll see that there in the right, I put X's next to the rhymes that do not rhyme and A's next to the rhyming words. The numbers there, 4343, that's the number of feet contained in those lines. The last quatrain looks a little different from the first quatrain. It has two more rhymes. It has a B rhyme now, the second and fourth lines, but they are, again, alternating lines of tetrameter and trimeter. So if I were to write a description of the meter and rhyme of this poem, I might write something like this. Dickinson's There's a Certain Slant of Light is a poem in 4 quatrains. The first and last quatrains consist of alternating trochaic, tetrameter, and trimeter lines. The 2 middle quatrains are entirely trimeter. Most lines are catalectic, so what that means is they're missing a terminal unstressed syllable to complete the measure. So these are trochees. She uses trochaic feet. So if the lines end on a stressed syllable, that means the foot is curtailed. It's missing its unstressed component. And we call that catalexis. So in the first 3 quatrains, the second and fourth lines rhyme. The final quatrain, however, marks substantial changes to both meter and rhyme. The first and third lines are acatalectic, that is, they are now complete trochaic lines with a caesurae after the second stressed syllable. A caesura is a pause that comes after. Usually, it's indicated by punctuation. In this case, commas. The lines, the first and third lines also rhyme, which creates an AB pattern, which in combination with the fully expanded measure in this quatrain gives extra weight or heft to the conclusion of the poem. So let's talk about the rhymes in this poem, as there are some interesting ones. First, I'm going to give you just some definitions of different kinds of rhymes. There's exact rhyme, which has identical vowel sounds combined with identical consonant sounds. Slant rhyme has similar vowel sounds, but maybe the consonants are different, or maybe the consonants are the same and the vowel sounds are slightly different. I rhyme is the spelling is the same, but pronunciation is different, so it looks the same when you read it on paper, but it would be sound different to the ear. Identical rhyme, which is just the repetition of the same word. Masculine rhyme, this is rhyme that occurs on the final stressed syllable of a metrical foot. And feminine rhyme, which occurs on the final unstressed syllable of a metrical foot. And this poem gives us examples of 4 of these. So we'll start with exact rhyme, and we're going to look at that second quatrain over there. Scar and R. Pretty identical vowel and consonant sounds there. We can go with slant rhyme next. And we're going to look at the last quatrain, the words listens and distance. They don't quite sound as like a polished rhyme like scar and R. A little different there. The vowel sounds are a little different with the E and the E in listens and the A in distance. So good example of slant rhyme. Masculine rhyme is when the rhyme occurs on the final stressed syllable of a metrical foot. So here we have despair, and then its rhyme is the fourth line, the air. And because I have the acute accent on pair and air, that gives us the masculine rhyme. It falls on the stressed syllable in those cases. And the feminine rhyme, actually going to go back to that fourth quatrain and look at listens and distance again. So again, we're looking at trochees here. Listens is the last one, the last trochee, and in line, that third line in the quatrain, distance is the last trochee. So the rhyme falls on the last syllable, which in this case is unstressed. So we call those feminine rhymes. Okay, so let's look at meter and rhyme in Macbeth. It's quite a lot to talk about. So I'm going to start with Act 3, Scene 2, lines 53 to 59. This is when Macbeth anticipates Banquo's murder, and he gives one of the eeriest speeches in the play. And I'm going to look at specifically at the third, fourth, fifth, and sixth lines in that excerpt there, because of the rhymes. Now these are iambic lines. Good things of day begin to droop and drowse, while night's black agents to their praise do rouse. Thou marvelest at my words, but hold thee still. Things bad begun make strong themselves by ill. And unusually for Shakespeare, much of his work is in blank verse or unrhymed iambic pentameter, but in this case he has two couplets back to back, drowse and do rouse, which is a brilliant rhyme, and then still and ill. It's unusual for Shakespeare. He does like to end dramatic speeches with couplets, but we've got two back to back here, which is interesting. And then another interesting feature of this speech is this half line that has only 3 feet. Shakespeare does this from time to time at the ends of speeches, so prithee go with me, which I think gives this speech a particularly creepy finale. He's speaking to Lady Macbeth here, and that's a half line. It is, in fact, the end of Scene 2. So next we're going to look at the sleepwalking scene. This is Act 5, Scene 1, lines 1 through 77. The doctor and gentlewoman remark on Lady Macbeth's somnambulism, her sleepwalking. And what's significant about this is that the scene starts in prose. It's not written in verse at all. You can see in the columns there that the lines go all the way to the end of the column. They're not written in verse. And this Shakespeare does this often. He does it with lower class characters, servant class characters, which makes this fairly typical in that regard. But then at the very end of the scene, the doctor suddenly starts speaking in blank verse. So it's prose all the way up to this point. And I'm going to blow it up a little bit because I want to show you some things here. So to regulate their meter, poets often use what's called elision to eliminate or combine syllables so that they don't have syllables to disrupt the rhythm of the line. Syncope is quite common and involves dropping letters to eliminate unwanted syllables. And when those letters are dropped, an apostrophe is put in there. We do this when we contract words like haven't or can't or shouldn't. And the example here is whisperings. So Shakespeare dropped the E from whisperings, just to cut it from a 3-syllable word to a 2-syllable word to maintain the pentameter. Similar to syncope is another one called syneresis. This involves combining 2 normally separated vowel sounds into one. I don't have an example here, and I wasn't going to hunt one down just to do that. So I'll give you an example. Like one that comes to mind is seest. Sometimes that would be combined together to ceased. Thou ceased instead of thou seest. Thou seest that fly over there on my cake. This third line in the doctor's speech gives us an example of what's called a hypercatalectic line, which is there's an extra syllable stuck on the end. So it's an iambic line, it's pentameter, but it has this extra 11th syllable on the end. We call that a hypercatalectic line. So finally, we're going to look at some of the witches lines. We're going to look at some at the beginning, Act 1, Scene 3, lines 28-29, and Act 4, Scene 1, lines 6 through 9. Actually, we're going to start with Act 4, the Act 4 lines. And here they are. And the witches, their incantations are quite famous. They are, for the most part, trochaic tetrameter lines. That is, they're composed mostly of trochees, although a lot of them are catalectic, and most of the lines have 4 feet. This is the most famous of the couplets: double, double, toil and trouble, fire, burn, and cauldron bubble. And the fire gets a little extra. It's actually pronounced with 2 syllables rather than 1. Some students ask me, is this a spondee? Because it sounds like it might be 2 stressed syllables back to back, fire, burn. But I think it should be fire, so it would have a little tail on it that would be unstressed to keep the trochaic measure intact. So in the 4th line there, they're talking about the toad. Boil thou first, if charmed pot. There's a pretty radical example of syncope there, with the in the being elided together into 1 syllable, if. And this is confusing, so the editor of the Oxford Shakespeare decided to put a grave accent over the E in charmed, so that it would be pronounced. So it's pronounced charmed pot, and that helps maintain the trochaic measure. Poets sometimes do this by themselves without the help of an editor, putting that accent over ed, especially to make sure that it gets pronounced as a separate syllable to maintain the meter. So you can see that in your edition of Macbeth. So here are the lines from Act 1, Scene 3. Again, it's a couplet, lines 28 and 29. And the reason that I'm pointing this one out to you all is because it shows us something a little different, another strategy that poets use to maintain metrical consistency called hyperbaton. This is the rearrangement of words from what is expected or customary. And I'm looking specifically at the second of those 2 lines, as homeward he did come, rather than as he came homeward. So moving words around to create new syllable combinations to maintain the trochaic meter is a pretty commonplace strategy for poets. This is the Protestant cemetery in Rome where Keats is buried. That's his tombstone there. Still there today. So some questions for discussion. I'd like for you to choose 2 to 3 stanzas from Poe's The Raven and Keats's Ode to a Nightingale and scan them. Scan them thoroughly. Identify their meter and rhyme schemes. How many different types of rhymes can you find? Masculine, feminine, slant rhyme, and which rhymes seem most original to you? Which ones seem particularly ingenious? And with that, we conclude not just this video on prosody, but the series Foundations of Literary Study.